The scene opens in the bitter cold of Wisconsin, February 1943. A troop train screeches to a halt at Camp McCoy, and the heavy doors roll open to reveal rows of German prisoners of war, many still in worn Afrika Korps uniforms, dust from North Africa clinging to their boots. They expect humiliation, perhaps hunger, perhaps the straw mats of a makeshift prison. Instead, as they shuffle across the snow-crusted platform, a different image burns into memory, the unmistakable scent of roasted coffee drifting from the camp kitchen. For men who had grown used to ersatz dark, bitter brews of roasted acorns and chicory back in Germany, this aroma is almost hallucinatory. It cuts through the crisp Wisconsin air like a mocking promise. Sergeant Karl Brenner, a former school teacher from Bremen, later wrote in a diary smuggled back to Europe, "We smelled America before we tasted it. Not the oil or the machines, but coffee, rich and endless." At dawn the next morning, February 17th, 1943, the ritual begins. Long lines of prisoners move through the mess hall, guarded but not rushed. Metal mugs are filled to the brim with steaming coffee, thick and dark, ladled from massive aluminum pots that never seem to empty. Statistics from the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps reveal that by 1944, America imported nearly 1.5 billion pounds of coffee annually, enough to ensure even prisoners of war could have a daily ration. By comparison, German civilians in Berlin might be lucky to secure a few ounces of substitute per month. The shock is not merely in the taste, but in the implication. Here, in a country mobilized for total war, the enemy still receives luxuries that soldiers at the front lines of Europe barely remember. Private Ernst Vogt, a mechanic from Hamburg, jotted a brief note on February 18th, "First sip. It burned my tongue, but I wept like a boy. I had forgotten the taste." It is a jarring contradiction, men captured in battle, stripped of weapons and pride, holding hot mugs of coffee between raw hands, outside the barracks. American guards smoke and sip from the same pots, the same blend, without distinction. The image burns deep, a democracy so confident in its abundance that it offers even enemies a taste of comfort. This is how their American captivity begins, not with chains, but with the aroma of coffee at sunrise. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And to make this moment more personal, where are you watching from right now? And what time of day is it as you hear these words? The first mornings at Camp McCoy quickly revealed a cultural collision disguised in a simple drink for Americans. Coffee was more than a beverage, it was ritual, energy, and democracy in liquid form. In factory towns across Wisconsin, workers began each shift with mugs steaming in their hands, fueling the labor that produced tractors, tanks, and uniforms for German prisoners, accustomed to scarcity and substitutes. The coffee line in the mess hall felt like stepping into another civilization. By March 1943, the camp settled into routine. Each dawn, prisoners lined up, mess tins clanking, the smell of brewing coffee hanging in the wooden rafters of the hall. Records show that every POW at McCoy received nearly 16 ounces daily, matching the rations of American soldiers. To men from Saxony or Bavaria, where chicory had replaced beans since 1940, this was staggering. Coffee had been a luxury before the war, rationed heavily after the blockade, yet here, behind barbed wire, abundance seemed casual, even careless. Not all accepted it without suspicion. Rumors spread quickly in the barracks. Was it a trick? Was the coffee laced with something to weaken resolve? Corporal Wilhelm Albrecht, a tailor from Leipzig, muttered to his bunkmate that no enemy could be so generous. Yet others argued differently. If Americans had so much coffee that even prisoners could drink freely, what else did they possess in surplus? In whispered debates late at night, the drink itself became a weapon, proof of a system that produced not only bombers, but comfort. One anecdote spread like gossip across the camp. An American cook had been overheard complaining that the POWs' coffee pots were draining supplies that could have gone to the guards. A lieutenant supposedly replied, "Let them drink, it's cheaper than guarding men who despair," whether true or not. The story stuck, and prisoners retold it as evidence of American pragmatism cloaked in generosity. At the same time, the cultural dissonance deepened. In Germany, coffee was a social marker served rarely, usually on Sundays, and only with ceremony. Here it was poured in battered tin mugs, consumed quickly, sometimes spilled carelessly on wooden floors. The informality shocked men who had grown up treating it as treasure. Lieutenant Otto Reimann, once a philosophy student in Munich, confided in a letter later intercepted by censors, "They treat coffee as water. That is the truest sign of power." The cup each morning was no longer just about taste, it was a symbol for the prisoners. Every swallow reinforced the painful contrast between a homeland scraping at substitutes and a captor nation that overflowed with plenty. Some clenched their mugs with resentment, others with wonder. But all understood one thing: coffee was not just a drink in America, it was proof that Germany's war economy could never compete. The mess hall emptied each morning with the clatter of tin, and silence followed, broken only by the steam rising from empty pots. By the summer of 1943, the morning coffee ritual had become part of camp life, but it carried layers of tension invisible to the casual observer, to the guards. It was a practical matter: keep the prisoners fed, caffeinated, and calm to the prisoners. Each cup carried meanings that shifted with mood and rumor. Some treated it as an unearned luxury, others as a humiliation. Inside the wooden barracks, arguments brewed as fiercely as the coffee itself. Sergeant Karl Brenner, who had once written poetry before the war, told his bunkmates that coffee was America's quiet weapon, a way of showing prisoners that their captors' abundance could outlast German sacrifice. His friend, Private Ernst Vogt, disagreed. He insisted it was only routine, nothing more. But his tone betrayed envy. By candlelight, they whispered of Berlin, where mothers boiled dandelion roots to make bitter substitutes for their children. In McCoy, even the enemy drank the real thing every morning. The contradictions gnawed at pride. When a guard laughed one morning and said, "Drink up, boys, it keeps you working on the farms," many bristled. Was generosity a mask for exploitation? Rumors spread of POWs sent to neighboring farms under labor agreements, where American families sometimes offered them extra cups at breakfast. Some POWs recounted, half in awe, half in anger, how a farmer's wife poured coffee into their cups before serving her own sons. Such gestures sparked furious debates in the barracks. Was it genuine kindness or another subtle humiliation? Diaries captured the emotional seesaw. Corporal Wilhelm Albrecht scribbled in late July, "Each swallow is pride swallowed too. Yet I do not refuse it. None of us do. We drink as if it were medicine, unable to stop." The phrase medicine lingered among the men, coffee as cure, as poison, as proof. Even small details fed suspicion. Some swore the coffee tasted stronger on Sundays, as if guards added extra beans before church services. Others argued that the taste changed depending on which cook was assigned. Tiny mysteries like this became topics of heated gossip, filling long afternoons with speculation. The daily ritual also softened some barriers. A handful of guards shared their mugs with prisoners during outdoor work details, sipping together as the sun rose over the Wisconsin fields. For brief moments, the enemy line blurred. One POW remembered seeing an African-American guard pour from the same pot into his tin cup, a silent act that shocked him more than the coffee itself. In Germany, such a sight would have been unthinkable. Yet beneath the warmth of steam, the tension remained. Coffee was both comfort and insult, both gift and reminder of defeat. Each sip forced the prisoners to reckon with the gap between what they once believed about German superiority and what they now lived behind barbed wire in America. The barracks always fell silent after coffee, men staring into empty mugs as if trying to read their own future in the dark grounds. As the war stretched into 1944, the daily coffee ritual began to intertwine with the lives of Americans beyond the barbed wire. The guards at Camp McCoy were not faceless soldiers, but men pulled from farms, factories, and small towns. Many were only a few years older than the prisoners they watched, and the coffee they drank was the same brewed strong, ladled from the same aluminum pots, poured into the same battered mugs. This quiet sameness chipped away at walls built by propaganda. One morning in April 1944, Private First Class John Miller, a guard whose family owned a dairy farm nearby, leaned against the mess hall door with his cup in hand. A group of POWs passed by, and one, Lieutenant Otto Reimann, dared to remark in halting English, "Same coffee, same steam, strange war." Miller chuckled, lifting his mug in mock salute. The brief exchange rippled through the barracks that evening, proof that their captors were not so different after all. Statistics framed these encounters. By mid-1944, more than 425,000 German POWs were scattered across 500 camps in the United States. Every camp ran on schedules powered by coffee guards beginning their shifts, cooks preparing meals, and prisoners sent out to local farms under labor agreements in the fields. Work often paused mid-morning for a shared break. Farmers' wives carried out thermoses, pouring coffee for everyone, Americans and Germans alike. For men raised in a society where civilians avoided fraternization with enemies, these moments felt surreal. Stories spread like wildfire. At one farm near Toma, a prisoner named Ernst Vogt was offered a second helping of coffee and, out of habit, reached for his ration coupon. The farmer's wife laughed, saying, "Keep your paper here, coffee is endless." The anecdote returned to camp as gossip. Fueling heated debates, was this kindness sincere, or a display of power? Not all interactions were light. Some guards resented the equal treatment. A corporal once barked that prisoners should be given weaker coffee than Americans, only to be overruled by a senior officer who insisted the Geneva Convention required fairness. That story, too, reached the prisoners, and they whispered about it for weeks, wondering what it meant that their enemy cared about such rules. The symbolism deepened. For American workers, coffee breaks were moments of equality. Factory supervisors and laborers often stood side by side with mugs in hand. For the Germans watching, this was a revelation. Class divisions that had once seemed permanent in Europe blurred over something as simple as caffeine. Lieutenant Reimann later scribbled in his diary, "Here, even workers sit with officers over the same drink. This may be their true strength." Each morning cup was no longer just sustenance. It was a mirror reflecting unfamiliar values, abundance, equality, and casual humanity. For some, this provoked unease. For others, curiosity, and always. The steam rising from the mugs carried unspoken questions about what kind of world awaited beyond the barbed wire. The image lingers: a guard and a prisoner standing shoulder to shoulder in the Wisconsin dawn, both blowing gently on their coffee before taking the first sip. By 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its bloody climax, but in the quiet of Camp McCoy, the coffee ritual remained steady, woven into the fabric of captivity. What changed, however, were the words written in secret diaries and the whispered rebellions that flickered like sparks inside the barracks. Every morning, sugar cubes clinked into metal mugs, and some prisoners began pocketing them, hoarding little white treasures in hidden corners of bunks. It was not hunger that drove this, but the instinct to cling to symbols of sweetness amid uncertainty. Others sketched tiny coffee pots in margins of letters, details so mundane they slipped past the eyes of American censors. One diary, later found in a forgotten trunk, contained a line dated January 12, 1945. "Strange that in prison we drink more coffee than our wives in Berlin." Rumors from home filtered into the camp through Red Cross mail. Berliners were boiling turnip peels, Munich mothers mixing roasted barley with beet syrup. Meanwhile, at McCoy, prisoners debated whether the endless supply they received was an insult or a privilege. Sergeant Karl Brenner once muttered, "Perhaps the Americans laugh at us, giving us what our nation cannot give its own people." The bitterness in his voice was sharper than the drink itself. Small rebellions grew out of these contradictions. Some prisoners deliberately spilled their coffee on the barrack floors, a silent gesture of refusal. Others mocked the guards with sarcastic toasts, raising mugs as if to salute a victory they did not want. Yet none ever truly refused to drink. The warmth was too necessary, the aroma too irresistible. The gossip mill never rested. One widely repeated story claimed that a cook had been scolded for using too much coffee per pot, as if the POWs were draining America's war chest one ladle at a time. Another tale, told with sly smiles, suggested that officers sometimes slipped whiskey into their mugs, daring the guards to notice, whether true or not. These anecdotes gave prisoners something to hold on to, evidence that even in captivity, they could bend the ritual into their own narrative. But beneath the jokes and rumors, there was quiet recognition the coffee breaks were reshaping perceptions. Lieutenant Otto Reimann scribbled a rare confession on March 5th each morning. "I see Americans drink without fear of shortage. It is like watching democracy pour itself into cups." Such words, though dangerous if discovered, reveal the creeping influence of everyday abundance on men once trained to see America as weak. And now I'd like to turn to you, the audience. If you were one of these prisoners, standing in line with a tin cup in your hands, would you drink eagerly or would you refuse out of pride? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is a question history cannot answer, but you can. The steam rising from the mugs in 1945 carried not just the scent of coffee, but the scent of change. By late summer 1945, after Germany's surrender, the war outside had ended, but for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners inside America, the morning ritual continued unchanged. Each sunrise at Camp McCoy still brought the clang of mess tins, the hiss of ladles pouring into mugs, and the mingling aroma of roasted beans. Yet now, the meaning had shifted. Coffee was no longer a comfort against uncertainty. It became a mirror, reflecting the gap between the world they once believed in and the world they now inhabited. The contrast grew sharper as news filtered into the camp. Letters described wives queuing for hours in ruined cities just to receive a spoonful of powdered chicory. Some families wrote that they had forgotten the real taste of coffee entirely. Against this backdrop, the steaming mugs at McCoy seemed almost obscene. A prisoner named Dieter Holtz confessed in his diary on October 2, 1945, "When I write to my mother, I cannot tell her. How could she bear to know that her son in prison drinks what she cannot find in freedom?" Statistics underscored this painful contrast. In 1945, U.S. coffee imports still exceeded 1.6 billion pounds, making America the undisputed capital of caffeinated abundance. Meanwhile, in occupied Germany, daily civilian rations had collapsed to near zero. Coffee in captivity became a paradox luxury inside the wire, deprivation outside, but there was more than bitterness. Guards often lingered at tables, drinking alongside prisoners, conversations shifting from war to weather, from harvests to baseball games. These small exchanges chipped away at enemy lines. One afternoon in September, a group of guards shared a thermos with POWs during a work detail, and someone joked, "If the world ends, at least we'll still have coffee." Laughter rose on both sides of the barbed wire, a sound unthinkable 2 years earlier. Still, not everyone embraced the change. Some older officers, hardened by ideology, warned their men that such comforts dulled vigilance, that America's generosity was a trap. Yet even they could not stop the habit of cupping their hands around a steaming mug, eyes closing for a moment of warmth. Symbols began to take root. For some, the coffee break became a ritual of surrender, proof of defeat. For others, it became a ritual of survival, proof that life contained simple joys even in captivity. The duality haunted them. Lieutenant Otto Reimann later wrote, "The real war is fought here in the space between bitterness and gratitude." Let me pause and ask you, the audience, if you had been in their place, would coffee have felt like kindness or cruelty? Would you have trusted the hand that poured it, or would you have seen it as proof of your nation's failure? I invite you to share your answer. Your perspective helps keep this history alive. The steam rising from those mugs in 1945 was more than a morning habit. It was the smoke of an old world burning away, and the promise of another beginning to form. The winter of 1946 brought the end of captivity. Trains stood ready at Camp McCoy, their carriages rattling with the anticipation of departure. German prisoners, once young soldiers hardened in the deserts of North Africa, now carried small bags and worn coats. As they filed toward the platforms, steam rose from engines and mingled with a more familiar steam drifting from the camp kitchen coffee. Brewed as always, poured as always, offered as always. It was the last cup, for many. The taste carried layers of memory, the first bewildering sip in 1943, the whispered suspicions, the jokes in the barracks, the quiet moments of unexpected kindness. Some prisoners drank quickly, refusing sentiment. Others lingered, holding their mugs in silence, as if memorizing the warmth in their hands. Lieutenant Otto Reimann pressed his lips to the rim and closed his eyes. Later, he would write strange, that in captivity I learned abundance. Strange that I leave it behind. Numbers framed the departure. Of the 371,683 German prisoners brought to America, nearly all returned home between 1945 and 1946. At McCoy alone, more than 7,000 men boarded trains across those months. Each carried scars of defeat, but also imprints of a daily ritual that had reshaped their sense of the possible. For some, coffee became a bitter reminder of what Germany had failed to provide. For others, it became a seed planted, an image of life that could exist without scarcity and hierarchy. Anecdotes followed them home. A few carried sugar cubes tucked deep in their pockets, keepsakes of abundance. Others spoke of American farmers who poured coffee before their own children drank. A story retold in ruined kitchens of Hamburg and Cologne. These fragments spread like rumors in reverse gossip, carried from captivity into a devastated homeland. As the trains pulled away, men pressed their hands to faint scars left by barbed wire, while the echo of whistles mixed with the memory of clattering mugs. Coffee had been no battlefield, no bomb, no victory parade. Yet it had been, in its own quiet way, a weapon, a liquid testament to abundance, equality, and democracy. One last image remains: the empty pots cooling in the mess hall, steam fading into silence, as if the ritual itself exhaled a final breath. The story of coffee at Camp McCoy may seem small, almost trivial compared to the thunder of tanks or the smoke of bombed cities. Yet, history often hides its sharpest lessons in the ordinary, in the steam rising from tin mugs. We glimpse the collision of two worlds, one bound by scarcity and control, the other fueled by abundance and confidence. For the German prisoners, every swallow was more than taste. It was confrontation with the reality that their captors, even in war, could afford generosity. Long after the barbed wire rusted away, the memory lingered. Former POWs spoke of it not as a detail, but as a symbol, the way democracy revealed itself not through lectures or propaganda, but through routine. In America, coffee was poured without ceremony, without hierarchy, without fear of shortage. Workers and officers, guards and prisoners, all drank the same. That was the quiet revolution, the subtle dismantling of beliefs carried from a homeland that had promised strength through deprivation. There is a haunting symmetry here. Some of those men returned to Germany and lived in ruins where even the smell of coffee was absent. Yet they carried the memory like a seed, a vision of what ordinary life could mean when rooted in plenty and shared without calculation. Perhaps it was not the bombers or the battlefields alone that reshaped their thinking, but also the smallest of rituals, a cup each morning, steam curling into the Wisconsin dawn. And so we end not with noise, but with silence. Imagine one of those men, decades later, seated by a window in post-war Europe, sipping coffee at last in freedom. In that moment, memory and present dissolve, and the simple act becomes both wound and healing.